The Lord be with you. Pray with me, please. We rise up to call you blessed, Lord, on this gorgeous day. We bless you supremely for Jesus, who loved us and gave himself for us. And we bless you for Frank Thomas, for all that you have made him to be by nature and by grace, for his seemingly boundless energy, his kind heart, his probing mind, and his courage. And we pray that all of those things will be released among us in this afternoon. So come, be a part of what we're doing today. In Jesus' name, amen. Have you been blessed by Frank Thomas? Yeah, it's true. Do you know that Garrison Keillor once turned his wit and wisdom to preaching, the stuff that we're about? This is what he said on the Prairie Home Companion. When a minister stands in front of a congregation, he or she has already interrupted what they've come to do in the first place, and the minister shouldn't do that, unless, of course, they have something to say. Then they should stand there, look the people right in the eye, and find something in their heart to say. We don't come to church to hear lectures on ethical behavior. We come to look into the mysteries. I think that Frank Thomas is qualified for that, looking into very profound mysteries. Now, I probably shouldn't say this with so many students here, but I have a subliminal grading scale for sermons. It has nothing to do with the charts and the scales. If I am listening to a sermon and it ignites joy in me because what's being said is truer than true, that gets an A. If, on the other hand, I'm listening to a sermon and somewhere in the middle of it, I just want to get up and take over, that's an A. I wanted to get up so many times today. It was just absolutely a wonderful gift, and we're eager for the afternoon. Frank, come.
We want to thank Mr. President for that very kind. When a president gives you a high mark, you know you're particularly a president who's a professor of preaching. That is high marks, and I thank you so much just for the hospitality. And we've had a good morning, and we hope now to conclude with a good afternoon. So let me get right to this lecture, and hopefully I want to make sure there's time for dialogue. So it's entitled, When Only a Few Lives Matter: Preaching, Race, and Moral Imagination. My argument is that we need moral imagination to discuss and deal with the perennial issues of race, the fact that only a few lives matter, and the phenomenon of shrinking whiteness in our culture. In my view, race and whiteness lurk under every aspect of American life, such that we grapple with it overtly and covertly all the time. Race is the third rail of American life, and one often wonders how much of our discussion is helpful, given that in our media, in our politics and religion, there is so much heat and so very little light. How does one constructively preach about the taboo subject of race and whiteness? And I purposely use the phrase race and whiteness because when we say the word race, typically we think that we're talking about brown and black people. So I use the term race and whiteness to connote that it's not just about brown and black people. When we talk about subjects of race, whiteness is also a subject that's very important for us to discuss. How does one constructively preach about the taboo subject of race and whiteness? How does one preach beyond the extremes of the Pollyanna, kumbaya platitudes based on scriptural truths that sound syrupy and sweet, or the other extreme, condescending, sacred, prophetic judgments offering the common currency of blame, condescension, and damnation? Or what happens in many pulpits, we don't preach about it at all, given the fact of its potential to polarize and divide. My experience is when we choose one of these three options, issues of race and whiteness that do not get dealt with do not go away. I learned in a Healing the Heart retreat that I went to on several weeks ago that buried feelings do not die. I hope in this lecture to increase our moral imagination such that we come to believe, discover, act, and live that more than a few lives matter. In the last 50 years, at least, America is fond of believing that the country has made significant racial progress, and in many places, given the awful stations of where we have started from in race relations, we have. What we are often not prepared for is the reality that this progress often comes as one step forward and sometimes two or more steps backwards. While we had hoped that the presidency of Barack Obama would move us forward in race relations in this country, and celebrated that, in fact, for many of us, given his inauguration, the disappointing fact and reality is that some of the response to President Obama's presidency has generated some of the most grotesque features of racism, othering, and exclusive whiteness. Much of this, amidst other critical and important global and economic factors, has led to the rise of Donald J. Trump. Laced with white supremacy and the alt-right brand of paranoid politics, including sexism, misogyny, xenophobia, conspiracy theories, etc., generally, we could agree that at least a portion of his campaign is white nationalism clothed in 21st century respectability. Let me quickly say that I'm not suggesting the dog whistle that everyone that supports Donald Trump is a racist. I'm not suggesting that. But neither can I dismiss the fact that appeals to whiteness is a theme of his campaign. And what was and is so dangerous in the campaign of Donald Trump is that normal white supremacist thought or whiteness by many average Americans has morphed with the paranoid style of white nationalist racist fringe of America to take over one of the two major political parties in the American political system. I did say the normal and everyday mainstream white supremacy or whiteness, so let me explain what I mean. When I suggest everyday and normal white supremacy and whiteness, I concur with Thomas Paine in his article, Bringing the Real is the name of the article, Lacan and Tupac. He says, by white supremacists, I do not mean to suggest that the entire nation is wearing Klan gear or painting graffiti swastikas. Instead, I intend the term to connote a de facto white supremacy where the privilege of whiteness is assumed and perpetrated across generations so that, taking the historically long view, the majority of property, wealth, and material goods are owned and operated for white profit. This inequality is embedded in our society by generations of choosing the comfort of apathy over genuine challenge of equality, material, political, rhetorical, and representational. Most Americans are not using the N-word, and the signs of white and colored are long gone. But the unconscious and conscious acts and intentions of white supremacy, particularly in its institutionalized expressions, ensure that the majority of goods and services and resources be mostly restricted to persons of European descent, with, of course, just enough minority persons securing goods and services and resources to provide cover that America is not openly racist and to ensure the myth that people can pull themselves up, quote unquote, by their own bootstraps. Because resources allow quality housing, healthcare services, economic development, decent insurance rates, effective policing, quality school, public services, grocery stores, businesses, and concerns by politicians, public policy, by virtue of bias, laws and statutes, courts' decisions, allocations of money for school education, policing practices, and American civil religion ensure that the majority of the resources remain in the hands of an even smaller group of quote-unquote white and privileged Americans. Parenthetically, let me suggest that the concept of America as the land where any man or woman can succeed is coming under more and more assault, and the factual evidence insists that it is not rags to riches, but rags to rags, or riches to riches. What I'm suggesting is that even some white people don't have access to whiteness. White privilege or whiteness is shrinking. Thomas Piketty suggests the source is what he calls patrimonial capitalism. Piketty suggests that between 1977 to 2007, 60% of the total increase of the national income of our nation went to the top 1%. The result is a few people who, by virtue of their wealth, have the potential to buy the political system and establish governance that primarily protects and advances their interest. It is not news to anyone that as wealth accumulates in fewer and fewer hands, the very rich have power over politics, government, and society. It has always been true that black and brown people were mostly excluded from resources, but massive inequality is indicative of the fact that whiteness is shrinking, and is not just that black lives don't matter. The reality is only a few lives matter. Let me illustrate one aspect of race and shrinking whiteness. Keynes suggests that one of the sites of white supremacy is the constructed mythology of the ghetto. Our national self-image is bound up in a white, simulated, quote, simulated suburban society. Those in many black and brown neighborhoods have been historically and materially separated from this simulated reality. Segregated into certain neighborhoods, the media portrays as random the apparent senseless acts of violence that wear only a black or Latino or Latina mask. The myth perpetrates the ghetto as a living nightmare, a place of violence and warfare, a jungle, if you will. Racially insensitive institutions are therefore justified in profiling many black youth, such as in the policies and tactics as war on drugs or law and order, resulting in the mass incarceration of many black and Hispanic people and the regular and systemic shooting of so many unarmed African Americans. There is the reality of gangs and the criminal element in the urban neighborhoods, and citizens want effective community policing that serves them and makes their neighborhoods safe and stable. This is not an anti-police diatribe. It is a call for effective and high-quality policing. Let me quickly say that it's not all the police, but the district attorneys, the review boards, the policies and the procedures, the laws of the land. If we could just have an independent review board, that might help significantly. It's the laws, it's the courts, it's the Supreme Court that sanctions so much of this, often based upon the politics of fear of black and brown bodies. Keynes suggests that the media's role seems to further inscribe the already centuries-old nativist and primitivistic view of African Americans perpetrated by white or white-thinking institutions. The paradigmatic example for white supremacist mythology of the black ghetto is Chicago, my hometown. We are often reminded of the number of shooting deaths in Chicago, quote-unquote, President Obama's hometown, as is often suggested, coupled with some comment about the prevalence of black-on-black crime. White-thinking institutions allow whites to take no responsibility for the social policy in the creation, construction, and preservation of the ghetto. America tends to assume that ghettos just happened, often by a lack of responsibility, initiative, and laziness of individuals and families. One of my favorite authors, Patrick Sharkey, argues The reality is that areas composed primarily of racial and ethnic minorities have been the object of severe disinvestment and abandonment for most of the past half a century. Because only a few lives matter, ghettos are the result of the social and public policy of America. Normal and average whiteness does not take any responsibility for ghettos, and one neighborhood having massive resources and another having virtually none. Whereas suburban communities have fared well, they have had massive support from the federal government. Again, Sharkey says suburban prosperity, where it exists, has been facilitated by federal investment in a highway and regional transformation systems that allow firms and workers to relocate outside of the central city. The expansion of home ownership in suburban America was possible because of the federally backed mortgages, and homeowners continue to be recipients of the largest housing policy the federal government operates, the home mortgage interest deduction, which disproportionately benefits middle and upper income homeowners and dwarfs any housing policy targeting low income populations. We could make the same argument for the regentrification of selected places in American cities as well. Whiteness does not mention Chicago is the most segregated city in America, and that segregation was created by housing policy, something called white flight, redlining, banks, insurance companies, neighborhood watch groups, racism, and other discriminatory practices that keep people trapped in certain neighborhoods. It does not mention the vast amount of unemployment based upon global economic shifts. And there is a role for choice and personal responsibility, but often the personal responsibility argument is meant to buttress denial of the effects of the whiteness of public policy. Sharkey argues that more often than not, the ghetto is inherited and passed down just like wealth. As wealth is passed from one generation to another, the ghetto is passed from one. In sum, various forms of inequality, lack of whiteness, is organized and clustered in social sites like neighborhoods, schools, and political districts. These social settings represent sites at which American inequality is generated, maintained, and reinforced. Inequality and equality is organized and spaced. Some places are organized around equality in space, other people as inequality. There are many people who benefit from the classification of good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods, and if you are benefiting, as I am, I live in a good neighborhood, it is easy to take no responsibility to have the option of whiteness or white privilege, even if one is a racial minority. Few of us, such as those of us who might have PhDs, make it into the category of whiteness. I realize that not every person has benefited from white supremacy, whiteness, or white privilege in the same way. There are significant numbers of white people who, just like those in the ghetto, have been left out of the resources or whiteness. I heard civil rights activist Ruby Sales talk about whiteness in some very interesting ways. In a podcast entitled Where Does It Hurt? I recommend it's up on SoundCloud. You can Google SoundCloud, Ruby Sales. She asked questions about how do we develop theology or theologies that deal with a capitalist technocracy where only a few lives matter? How do we raise people up from disposability to essentiality? She asked, what is the public theology that can say to the white person in Massachusetts or the 45-year-old person in Appalachian who is heroin addicted because they feel their lives have no meaning, often the result of trickle-down whiteness in the world today? She argues that many white people have been told their whole lives that their essence is whiteness, is power, is domination, and when that no longer exists, they feel like they're dying or get caught up in the throes of death. Her comments remind me of the article by Anna Case, the published work of Anna Case and Sir Angus Deaton. I hope you had a chance to read it. It was called Rising Morbidity and Mortality in Middle Life Among White, Non-Hispanic Americans in the 21st Century. This published study documents significant increases in the mortality of middle-aged white non-Hispanic men and women in the United States between 1990 and 2013. According to the report, midlife mortality rates fell in every racial and ethnic group and those 65 and above, except for middle-aged white non-Hispanic men and women. Here is an excerpt from the report. This increase for whites was largely accounted for by increasing death rates from drug and alcohol poisonings, suicide, and chronic liver diseases and cirrhosis. This change reversed decades of progress in mortality and was unique to the United States. No other rich country saw a similar turnaround. Those with less education saw the most marked increases. Rising midlife mortality rates of white non-Hispanics were paralleled by increases in midlife morbidity. Self-reported declines in health, mental health, the ability to conduct the activities of daily living, and increases in chronic pain and inability to work, as well as clinically measured deteriorations in liver functions, all point to a growing distress in this population. In the attempt to locate the cause of rising midlife mortality and morbidity, Paul Krugman writes, in a recent interview, Mr. Deaton suggested that middle-aged whites have lost the narrative of their lives. That is, their economic setbacks have hit hard because they expected better. Or to put it differently, we're looking at people who were raised to believe in the American dream and are coping badly with its failure to come true. Ruby Sales argues this is why Donald Trump is essential. Though many of us do not agree with him, many see him as speaking to their pain. So where's the church? And where are the preachers that redefine for them what it means to be fully human? She argues there is a spiritual crisis in white America. She says there's a crisis of meaning in white America. She says this, we talked a lot today about black theologies, but I want a liberating white theology. I want a theology that speaks to Appalachia. I want a theology that begins to deepen people's understanding of their capacity to live fully human lives and to touch the goodness inside of themselves rather than call upon a part of themselves that is not relational. She says, because it is nothing wrong with being European American. That's not the problem. It's how you actualize that history and how you actualize that reality. She says that it's almost like white people do not believe that other white people are worthy of being redeemed. She believes that it is sexier to deal with black folks than to deal with white folks if you're a white person. She wants, and I do too, a theology that gives hope and meaning to people who are struggling to have meaning in the world where they are no longer as essential to whiteness as they once were, whether they're black, Hispanic, female, LGBTQ, or anything else. I want a white and black theology that takes up the genuine challenge of equality, material, political, rhetorical, and representational. I want to suggest this afternoon, and briefly in this lecture, that we might take up the genuine challenge of preaching equality by analyzing the speech of Robert F. Kennedy on April 4th, 1968, given in Indianapolis, Indiana, the night of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. My goal in just a few minutes will be to look at the means of persuasion for clues and indicators as to how we might have a fruitful discussion of race and whiteness in our preaching. I believe that Kennedy's speech had a constructive discussion of race and whiteness. Though there is significant difference between the social periods of 1968 and 2016 today, a close look at Kennedy's 8-minute speech will offer insights as to how we might talk about race and whiteness in preaching such that we would be able to articulate that more than a few lives matter. Now, let me give you some backdrop before we go to the speech. The relationship between the Kennedys, President John F. and attorney Robert F. Kennedy, with the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King has been well documented. In spite of intervening on behalf of the civil rights movement, Robert F. Kennedy on October 10, 1963, signed a request from then director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover to wiretap the phones of Martin Luther King Jr. The FBI accumulated over 1 million pages of intelligence on Martin Luther King Jr., making him the most harassed and hounded citizen in the history of the American Republic. Some have never been able to look beyond this signature of Kennedy based upon the psychological and physical damage caused by the FBI to King and the civil rights movement and others in the black community anchored in the ability to wiretap phones. Despite this checkered history and his own personal history of affluence and privileged whiteness, by 1968, Kennedy had established himself as a vocal advocate for civil rights, social justice, peace, and nonviolence. Kennedy had investigated poverty and hunger in Mississippi and came out with the moral indignation and purpose to overcome poverty and reconcile race relations in America. By this point, in regards to the black community, Kennedy had established an intimate connection and garnered the trust of many. After President Lyndon Johnson's declaration that he would not enter the 1968 presidential race, Kennedy announced his candidacy. On March 28, 1968, Kennedy filled a petition for his candidacy as president in Indiana and kicked off his campaign with a trip through South Bend. At the gymnasium of Ball State University, an African-American student shouted a question that seemingly almost interrupted Kennedy. "Mr. Kennedy, you have a great deal of faith in white America. Is that faith justified?" Kennedy responded that the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people want to live together in this nation. Following that speech at 7:35 p.m., Kennedy got on a plane to Indianapolis, where he heard the news that Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot in Memphis, Tennessee. At 8:40 p.m., he was informed that King had died from his wounds. The consensus of public officials in Washington and Indianapolis, including local police, was that his scheduled Indianapolis campaign stop be canceled. Civil rights leader John Lewis was the countervailing voice that counseled Kennedy that he should go. At 8:45 p.m., the crowd for the campaign stop gathered in Indianapolis. The majority of the crowd made up of both white and black. Some knew of the death of King and some did not. Black militants had come angry and ready to do harm to white people. As witnesses attest, they were not the only ones who were armed. While there's no way to estimate, there was also gasoline, chains, guns, and knives. There were police rifles on rooftops. I know this is hard stuff. I know it's hard. It was hard to write. At 9:25, Kennedy pulled out yellow sheets of his quickly constructed handwritten notes as he rose on a flatbed truck. I want you to turn to that screen, and we're going to watch.
Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land with an effort to understand and compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And want to dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll make a couple comments and then I'll close. One of the things that strikes me is, how do you stand up to a group of people and tell them that Martin Luther... Yeah, I planned that. That was a plan. How do you get up in front of a group of people and tell them Martin Luther King Jr. has been assassinated in Memphis, and they scream? And 8 minutes later, 7 minutes later, they clap and applaud. How do you do that? That was the original point of my interest in the speech, because I think that's some of what preachers should be able to do. How do you confront a crowd with the stark reality of evil for what it is and still able to offer a word of hope? I call that moral imagination. So I'm struck by the moral imagination of Robert F. Kennedy as expressed in the thoughts, content, feeling, moods, and tones of this speech. I believe that what we need most, and often find the most lacking in this nation at this present moment, is moral imagination. There are people who are working in creative and morally imaginative ways. They are doing great work in things. We just sometimes maybe hear so much of the bad news We don't hear enough of the good things. I want to suggest that our scriptural texts are filled with moral imagination. I think that it would be perfectly fine that someone, the preacher, would lift the beauty, the depth, and the transformative power of the moral imagination of our Bible. My purpose is to explore how we might increase our moral imagination so that we could lift the beauty, the depth, the transformative power of our scripture, the wisdom of the ages, to address the evil and the sin and call people to a higher place. I want to briefly define moral imagination and then several characteristics in the speech that might be relevant teaching material for all of us. And then I'll sit down. Moral imagination is a term that was coined by Edmund Burke and occurs in his reflections on the revolution in France. Burke laments the revolutionaries' disregard for moral imagination, indicative, this is the French Revolution, of the strong and sudden changes being brought to customs and institutions of civil society. This is what Burke said. All the decent drapery of life is being rudely torn off. All of the super-added ideas furnished from the wardrobe of a moral imagination, which the heart owns and the understanding ratifies, as necessary to cover the defects of our own naked, shivering nature, and to raise it to dignity in our estimation, are being exploded as ridiculous, absurd, and antiquated fashion. The moral imagination is an enduring source of inspiration that elevates human beings to first principles as it guides upwards towards virtue, wisdom, and redemption. Russell Kirk, who popularized Burke's term moral imagination, suggests that moral imagination aspires to the apprehending of right order in the soul and right order in the commonwealth. In an article entitled Defining Moral Imagination, Jonathan Jones gave a fuller explanation of the concept. To be a citizen is not to be an autonomous individual. It is a status given by a born existence into a world of relations to others. To be fully human is to embrace the duties and obligations toward a purpose of security and endurance for first and foremost the family and the local community. Success is measured by the development of character, not the fleeting emotions of status. Thinking sacramentally, meaning human beings are connected with the sacramental order of creation, a configuration of the mind in communion with the divine and beyond rational. This is a sense that nature was created in such a manner that humans can draw true analogies, wisdom inaccessible by scientific method. With this as a backdrop, I'm so interested in your feedback. With this as a backdrop, I would define moral imagination as the ability of the preacher, intuitive or otherwise, in the midst of chaotic experiences to perceive God's abiding wisdom and ethical truths that benefit the individual and the common good. I would define moral imagination in the preacher as the ability in the midst of chaotic circumstances and situations to perceive God's abiding wisdom and ethical truth that benefits the individual and the common good. Let me now turn to the characteristics in the speech. The first characteristic of moral imagination was that Kennedy had the capacity to envision equality. Earlier in this lecture, I quoted Thomas Paine, who said in reference to white supremacy that inequality is embedded in our society by generations of choosing the comfort of apathy over genuine challenges of equality. Kennedy had the moral imagination to overcome apathy and adopt a challenge of equality. The most visible and tangible evidence is that he showed up. He showed up in the ghetto. He moved beyond the stereotype of the ghetto as a place of violence and mayhem, a jungle, if you will. At the risk of violence, he showed up. He communicated by his physical presence, even before his words, that he genuinely believed that all lives matter. He severed the simulated suburban society ghetto myth, moved out of his privileged position, and was found in a black neighborhood the night of the death of Martin Luther King. It takes moral imagination to demonstrate physical presence in a time of crisis and danger. I think we underestimate the role of physical presence in dangerous neighborhoods. The second characteristic, and I really want you to get this one, is that he saw empathy as a catalyst or a bridge that had the potential to create opportunities to overcome the past and make new decisions for peace and justice. In the midst of crisis, he believed that empathy, the ability to understand, comprehend, and love were resources for new community. He had the moral imagination to harness the challenge that King's death was a significant opportunity for all to see their common humanity. While there are many poignant moments in the speech, certainly this is one of the most gripping. After stating that evidence was that King was killed by a white man, he understood how blacks could be upset and would want to do violence and harm. He says that he had those same feelings because his brother was killed. Someone in his family is what he said, was killed by a white man. King's death was no longer about race. It was about grief, about the loss of someone you love deeply, something that was common to us all. This was the first time he ever addressed his brother's death in public. He was even wearing his brother's his brother's coat as he was giving the speech. I will return to this at the end, but based upon his own experience of grief and loss, he could see empathy as a bridge for new decisions for equality. Because maybe in common empathy, we could discover that all lives matter. Thirdly, for those of us who are preachers and theologians, he found wisdom in ancient text. It wasn't the Bible, but I believe that we must find wisdom in sacred texts. Sources say that when his brother was killed, he was a Catholic and had a crisis of faith. The night of his brother's death, he was heard to cry out through a door, "Why, God?" Those close to him say that after the event, he lost his faith. He wrestled with blaming himself for his brother's death, given his work in the assassination plot of Fidel Castro in Cuba and his work against the mafia. The very afternoon of his brother's death, he got on the phone and called the mafia and asked them if they had killed his brother. They said they had not. He had a crisis of faith. From his reading in Greek mythology, he concluded that pride and arrogance would result in payback from the gods. Foolish pride and dangerous overconfidence challenges the gods and brings about human downfall. He considered that the Kennedys had overreached and his brother's death was the gods taking retribution on the family. He overreached in doing an assassination plot on Fidel Castro. In the Greeks, he saw that the great fall of humankind is pride and arrogance. And so he found this quote in Aeschylus, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." He concluded that suffering produces wisdom. This suffering, this death of King, like the death of his brother, could produce great wisdom. It opens up great empathy and creates the opportunity for new decisions to understand, comprehend, and love, because we all grieve. Fourthly, no matter the economic or employment condition, art and poetry elevates the human spirit. While this is a risky proposition, it might be safe to assume that the majority of the crowd probably never heard of Aeschylus. And yet he dares to quote Aeschylus. To me, it's something about addressing the audience in the noblest terms: poetry, music, dance, drama, art, the noble lifting of the human spirit. This is why I don't like reality TV. It's cheap. I love the Greek tragedies. I love Shakespeare because they're wrestling with the deepest issues of life: betrayal, violence. And reality TV is shallow, simple, crazy, and what's deeply at hand? How is this quote able to be effective? They may not even know Aeschylus. And then we as preachers say they don't know the scriptures. We can't preach because they don't know the scriptures. He quotes Aeschylus. They don't know Aeschylus in all likelihood. I don't want to judge anybody. So how was he able to convey that? The conclusion to the matter was that riots occurred in 76 cities. 46 people were killed, 2,000 people injured, and 28,000 people were jailed across America after his speech. Indianapolis did not. Finally, and very finally, I want to get back to this concept of empathy as a catalyst or a bridge that has the potential to create opportunities to overcome the past and make new decisions for peace and justice. While I am not a prophet of doom, I think it's going to take great death to break past the divisions in our culture to allow a window for genuine empathy. I think we're so divided. It's going to take some great cataclysmic event. Remember, I said that Kennedy saw King's death as an opportunity. What kind of death will provide a kind of window that we need to bridge the racial divide, the economic inequality, and all the terrible divisions that we have seen front and center in the election and still continues today? We are the most diverse nation on earth. And what will it take in the 21st century? We had World War I in the 20th century, and that was enough for a little while. Then we had the Great Depression. That was enough for a little while. Then we had World War II. We just had the Great Recession. What would it take? Could you imagine some massive climate-based disaster that creates enough death that we might have common empathy to move past labels like Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal, city and suburb, small town and ghetto? What is it going to take? Some strain of disease that kills? How many people will it take? What about some form of a dirty bomb? What's it going to take? It does not take long to conclude that we're acting pretty arrogantly now. I teach with Alan Bossart, and he has such a sharp critique on our American foreign policy, how arrogantly we're acting around the world. He tells me, y'all are caught up in an election, when in fact, is either person going to change America's foreign policy around the globe? So to us around the globe, it don't make a difference. Because even with Obama, your imperialistic policy has not changed. And so I guess I'm getting you and me ready for the kind of moral imagination it's going to take. I started to get real Old Testament or real, this is the children of Israel, they had to be judged and blah, blah, blah. I could do the biblical metaphors. But I really wonder, what is it going to take? How many lives, how much death is it going to take before we develop a common empathy? Only in the death of Martin Luther King could he rise. So, let me stop there. Thank you so much. Amen.
Thank you. We're going to do a little Q&A time. We've got a little while, maybe 20 minutes left before we take a break. And just stand up here and let's open up the floor for questions or comments.
So what did y'all think? It's a lot of work to get that out. It's a lot of hours, a lot of hours. What did you all think? What did you feel? What did you hear?
Because it's quiet, so you can just tell me when to be quick, because I'm sure if you all have questions asked. A couple points of clarity before response. When you talked about Thomas Kane.
Yes. Two partnerships, yeah. Lacan and Shakur, yes.
Okay. And then if you're Googling it for Ruby Sales, it was on Being, and it'll come right up on Being. Maybe start there. For those who don't know Ruby Sales, she was 16 and she was helping folks register to vote. Jonathan Daniels, who's an Episcopal priest from Princeton, stepped in front of her. He took a bullet right in front of her. She didn't speak for the next year. She's an Episcopal priest and an extraordinary woman of God and a force. So going back to that, since she started with white people, almost majority of the folks in this room are white folks. When she asks, where does it hurt?
What she asked?
When she asks, where does it hurt?
Yes.
For us, as white preachers, who would like to keep our jobs, right?
Right.
But most of us, if we really have a prophetic voice to white folks, we're not going to keep a job.
Right.
Laugh, but the truth hurts, baby. There's so much pain and fury. Just fury that I'm seeing at the Trump and the Pence rallies that I've been around the periphery. So as preachers, when you say, where does it hurt? Just like, when hospice casualty, when it hurts so much, the folks just rage.
Yes.
Kennedy showed how to talk to the hurt, but it was talking to American folks, and it was empathy. You knew what death is.
Right.
For those of us who the anger is just everywhere, it's amorphic. People don't even know how to direct it. So if you come and say, where does it hurt? You will be directed to you.
Right.
How can we ask the question, where does it hurt? And create a place for people to see that they're causing the pain.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. I said this to Steve last night at dinner, that whenever we are taking hard-line political stances, that if we could ask, where does it hurt that the vocal part of it is a hard-line political stance? Where does this hurt? I can tell you clearly where a Trump presidency hurts in my soul. And to be able to articulate that and express that is the chance to heal and grow. But if I keep articulating it at the level of a person or a policy, so maybe we're so rigid in our policies or our political positions because underneath it is some hurt. And if we could talk about the hurt, it could get heard and get dealt with. This is where this whole question of empathy comes in. Maybe we could get down to where the real issues of the fear are. And without the real issues of the fear, and this is people, this is not, that's why I love the part in the speech when she said, there's nothing wrong with being a European American, that's not the issue. It's how you actualize that. And so African Americans and Hispanics, Latinas, everybody else has hurt. And what you do with that hurt, sometimes it's a great political force or mobilizer for political positions. But sometimes it can be harmful. And so her question was, or her comment, if you listen to her lecture, is can we get to a position where we can take our positions and then say what hurts that helped us get to that position? And if that can get heard, we may be able to relate on a level of common humanity. Did y'all hear me? Yes.
I'm going to change the subject. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I am the pastor in a white church in a white community, and I care deeply about equality. I think my observation is that my congregation has the luxury of the privilege of not thinking that it really matters for their lives.
Right.
So my challenge is to poke in God gently as a preacher. Any tips on how to do that, how not to do that?
Thank you so much for the question. It is, Martin Luther King used to say, when you know the human heart, when you know your own heart, you know everybody's heart. So sometimes when I teach preaching, we like to think that the ghetto is where all the problems are, and that I have a nice suburban congregation and it's affluent and it's doing well and blah, 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 and here you are, talking about all this stuff over here and we're doing fine. And I said, well, I don't let people, you mean there's no rape out in this, there's no molestations? There's no drug addiction? There are no suicides? I mean, and then I have this is a joke, so I want you to take it like this. The fall occurred in paradise. It wasn't in the ghetto. I love to say that, it's a joke. In other words, they had everything. And so are we going to pretend like because we're affluent, because we can write checks, because we're a little bit distant from the survival level that many people live at, that they're not rapes, drug addiction, molestations? So how do you let people not pretend? That's what I grapple with all the time. I pastored an African-American suburban group for 18 years. Money, wealth, creme de la creme, the American dream, middle class, upper middle class, the whole deal. And when I first went out there, I was on them. So I had come out of seminary, and I went to Chicago Theological Seminary, and they trained us that we were going to be prophets, bulls in china shops. When we spoke the prophetic word, expect retribution. So I envisioned a ministry on 74th and Jeffrey in Chicago, which is inner city neighborhood, and I got called to the suburban church. I went out there, and they rolling up in Jaguars and rolling up in this kind of stuff, and I'm like, I was a bull in a china shop. You know how much damage I did? And I read a book by Henry Mitchell that said in Ezekiel, he went down by the river Shebar, and he sat where they sat, and he wept for 7 years, I think it is. When I sat where the people sat and didn't judge them, I found all kind of astounding ways to preach prophetically. I remember a sermon I wrote called Knock on Any Door. You can go any door in this high-class neighborhood with gates and all of that, and you can knock on any door you want to, and the word of God is needed. Because behind is the human condition, right? So I say to you, thank you for your question. I think it's about pushing down deep into the human experience and not being fooled by, not that you are, this is just my comment, by the trappings of success. Marriages are falling apart, affairs. Hello? I mean, come on. We're going to sit up in church and act like the kids know what's going on. We see it in the youth ministry. Go to the youth ministry and sit in the youth ministry and watch the youth spill it out. Or why is this kid acting out in school? Mom and dad doing something, pretending a whole different thing. And so for me, I try not to allow us to get away from the depth of the human condition. And I try not to judge. I hope that you could get the sense that I didn't try to judge, just tell the truth. And one more thing I'll say to you, and thank you for the question. I think deeply about this, as you can see. See, what I didn't realize is that you earn the right to be prophetic in a congregation. And after you walk enough hospital floors, and after you do enough homegoing celebrations, you perform enough weddings, you bless enough babies, after the people know you love them, you get a little bit more room to be prophetic. So there's not a separation between the prophetic and pastoral care. We make that separation, right? But you earn the right to be prophetic. And so when I walked enough hospital floors, when I cried with enough members, when I went down with the mother and father as their son is being sentenced and sat there, I earned the right to speak prophetically into the people's lives. So that's my feedback. I hope that helps. It's just kind of, it helps? Good.
The challenge, I think, so preaching, I mean, the human condition is a human condition.
Right.
Except not everybody sees those bridges.
Right.
My human condition is also the human condition of people on the other.
Right. But you can sneak at it in a text. Because the text is filled with human condition. So let's do Judas. You can't steal this. This is my sermon. Well, a friend of mine started off a sermon quoting Dostoevsky in his book where guilt, a person had gotten scot-free away with the crime. You remember that? But the guilt. And so it's like, the name of the sermon would be, it's Susan Smith's sermon, Cut Down the Noose. And she talks about, opens with Dostoevsky and she slides to Judas, how guilt eats at you. And fundamentally, her concept is cut down the noose. And so guilt, there's no guilt in that room? Hello? I got Judas. And then I'm going to be talking about Judas's guilt, but guess what? If my heart is open to you, you're talking about my guilt. So I think the scripture is filled with wonderful human conditions, betrayals, motivations, things that we can walk into the human hearts of people. So use the scripture. It's a natural entree. Then you can do the tradition. I'm coming to you. Then you do the traditional. They say, you were talking about me. Y'all know that whitewashed tombs, you get up and you're mad, angry, you get in your preach. You whitewashed tombs, you workers of iniquity. And they know they talking about the ushers, the deacons or somebody, and you say, I wasn't talking about anybody. They say, no, you know you're talking. The same way that they know when you're talking about guilt in Judas, or you talk about the prodigal son, and the mother's sitting there in tears because last night the father threw the son out. And she's in pieces. And both of them are attorneys. Both of them got major law firms. But the boy was doing drugs and the father threw him out never to come back. And you're preaching the prodigal son, talking about reconciliation. The son that was lost is now found. Was dead is now alive. I didn't know as a preacher that he was thrown out last night. Y'all hear me? Y'all hear me? It's in that. It's the wisdom of the ages. I had a promise back here, and I'll come to you. Yes.
You talked about the importance of physically showing up.
Yes.
What does it look like for a white preacher or a white community or just a white Christian to physically show up without being paternalistic or embodying a white messiah complex?
Yes, thank you. I believe that it starts with personal relationships. And so I built a personal relationship with a white preacher in Memphis, Tennessee. And I called him up on the phone and said, let's go to lunch. And I'm not interested in discussing how many members you have and how many members I have. I just want to be friends. And so when you build relationship, you find entree. So for example, I got into a nasty lawsuit with some of the members of the congregation. And they decided they wanted to get rid of me. So they trumped up some charges, went to a judge, and I had to come and answer with the newspaper, and it was just a mess. And there were a lot of preachers, African American, who wouldn't come anywhere near me. Do you know that white preacher showed up? Do you know what that meant to me and my congregation? He could come anytime into our church. Anytime. He could say, he could preach prophetically to us. He could, because he took the risk. He built a relationship. So I think it's relationships first. We tend to do big events. We do the exchange of the black church and the white church or the Hispanic church, and there's a place for all of that. But deep work happens out of relationship when we're sharing lives. And I think that if pastors begin to share lives, I think it'll flow out to the people. So I would suggest some of that, and then flowing out to some of the members and building these relationships so we can talk. And I think it would be a great help so that you're not seen paternalistic. Yes, sir.
Yeah, as pastors and preachers of predominantly Caucasian congregations and multiracial congregations, can you maybe give some advice as to the church's relationship with the Black Lives Matter movement, along with sort of Colin Kaepernick?
Yeah, thank you so much. You helped me sell my latest book. I did in the latest book, the one that was read that Steve held up a minute ago in the first session. The last section of the book is the struggle that the church has with Black Lives Matter, and particularly those issues around the hetero-dominant leadership style of black churches. And so I do a lot of thinking about that. And I think it goes back to this question of where does it hurt? I think if you could get people in a room and by the grace of God create the atmosphere to understand, and this is true, there is a real crisis amongst some of uneducated whites that are supporting Trump. There is the statistics bear it out. There's a real crisis there. That's not made up. But who takes that crisis seriously, or how do we address it, or how do we talk about it? What is it like? What is life like when you've been sold a bill of goods relative to the American dream, and these places are closing, and these towns, and things? Tell me about that. What is that like? And I know I'm being idealistic, but maybe the Black Lives Matter. What does it feel like that when you get stopped or potentially stopped by a police officer, you're scared to death that it's not going to be a friendly encounter? And so how do you respect other people's experience, even if it's different than yours? I'm like that. I'm law-abiding. I pay my taxes. And if I get stopped by the police, I'm nervous. And so I don't make any sudden moves. Yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, whatever the case is, because I'm not sure that this is going to be a positive encounter. And that's not to berate all police, because some of the stuff I say in some of these places, it takes the police to get me out of there. I'm liable to need a police escort out of here. So I'm not beating up on the police. I just say there are thugs in every profession. There are thugs in clergy, there are thugs in police, there are thugs in principals, and so what we want is get the thugs out. And then I said that, and a group jumped on me for saying the word thugs. You calling us thugs? Okay. The bad people. Can I just say bad people, right? Say bad people. So I think it's, can we listen? And can we validate people's experience, even if it's hard for us to agree? Yes, come on. And I see you edging to me, so come on. We'll make it.
Going to be a short question, because we do need to.
Yeah, short. Sure. So what would you say to the young seminarian that's looking to go into ministry, that if they're passionate about justice, sees the biblical witness and sees it's full of justice, and yet they see their friends or they see the church in general, and they kind of have the critique of Martin Luther King in a letter from a Birmingham jail, like the white moderate that does kind of say, yeah, white privilege exists, but they don't want to do anything about it. What would you say, just a word of wisdom or encouragement to a seminarian that's kind of struggling with, like, not really understanding that folk really don't want to be about justice. They like the concept of justice, but justice on the ground, they might not be willing to do the work of justice on the ground.
one of the analysis of Robert Kennedy's speech is it's the rhetoric of control. There's a critique of that speech. So what you do is calm everybody down, send them home, right? And they don't organize for justice. There's a critique of that, right? Didn't have time to include that, but there's a critique of it. So I would say to you, do a lot of listening and a lot of talking, and then when it really gets down to it, go with those who are willing to go, and don't spend a lot of energy trying to convince folk that don't want to be convinced. Let me say this, Stephen, I'm out. We did a video about lynching. It was the 75th anniversary of Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. And my president's wife is Salt Project. She asked me to write a sermon, and then she set the sermon to video. And I played the video at a lecture I did, and some of the kids kept saying, but they won't let us talk like that in church, or they don't let, all this, they won't let. So I said, didn't you just say that there was one church out of all them churches in your city that would let y'all do that? Work with the ones who let you. You can't convince people. I mean, you can share, you can talk. That's part of what we do. That's part of convincing. But at some point, after Mama would explain it 2 or 3 times, she said, this ain't about explanation. This is about you don't want to do it. And so ultimately, work hard, I would say, to convince. Martin Luther King did it. All of the great leaders, they're working hard to convince. When just know it's always a voice crying out in the wilderness. And go with the people who are willing to go. I think that's what I want to say to you. Amen.